Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on what time you're watching this. My name is Connor from 905 Review. Thank you so much for tuning into our series Give This a Spin, where I recommend you guys some of my favorite albums. Today with a very influential group's debut release, which would be Death and their 1987 album, Scream Bloody Gore. Death is a band hailing from Florida behind the brilliant mind of Chuck Schuldiner, who would go on to become one of the biggest names in metal. This album was one of the pioneers of the death metal genre and has a track listing that sounds just about as hardcore as you would ever find, heavily based around themes of horror. With that brief intro out of the way, we'll jump right into the track listing. Right when you toss this album on, Death eases you into what you're getting into on Infernal Death. Some heavy, sludgy tunes set our pace before we hear our first Chuck growl that certainly won't be our last, and then the band kicks it up a notch. If this doesn't get your blood flowing, I don't know what will. Honestly, I don't think I can even headbang fast enough to keep up with the pace of the drums on this thing. One song in and I'm already breaking a sweat. Next we go to Zombie Ritual with its absolutely killer intro. I love the drums on this, I love the bass on this, and I love the guitar on this, but to be honest, this does make me think of mummies more than it does zombies. The drums throughout are fantastic. I love this absolutely thunderous sound that they bring. There's some awfully descriptive lyrics throughout this track, and I assume this is the one that the album's artwork was based on. Fantastic song. Absolutely pummeling. I love it. Following this, we jump right into Denial of Life, and man, just listening to the riff, I can only imagine the stress these guys feel on their hands and their fingers playing this. The song eventually slows down for the chorus. Well, it slows down by Death's standards, but is still relatively pretty quick. As much as I love the speed and intensity that Death usually plays with, their slower stuff is equally as wicked to me, as heard in the intro to Sacrificial. It is certainly the most grotesque song on the album, and one that the band had to change the title of due to pressure from their label Combat Records. Next, with another ridiculous track, we end the first side of the album with Mutilation. From what I recall, it's a song with the fewest different lyrics in it, but what else do you need to know aside from You Will Die in Pain and Mutilation? This is probably the most fun song to sing along to on the album, though, to be honest. Yes, yes, yes. I love the drumming on this. It's so brutal, and the fills get me going. After forcing himself to growl like that throughout an entire show, I don't know how Chuck wouldn't just pass out right after finishing something like this. Opening side B of the album, we have the track Regurgitated Guts. Probably the song closest on the album to breaching towards thrash metal territory, if not for Chuck's aforementioned growling. Next up is the track Baptized in Blood, which I would think is Chuck's best performance on the album vocally, especially when he goes up for the higher notes on this, because I can only imagine how much more that would hurt your throat. My favorite part of the song is definitely the chorus. I find it real impressive how they can go from so fast to slowing down instantaneously, then getting right back into it without missing a step. Contrary to this, the first time I heard this album, this is actually something that, if I recall, I had against it, because I would think they're like slowing down for like a breakdown, and then before you can even before you as the listener can even adjust to the speed, they get fast with it again, and then you're like, oh, okay, like sick prank, and then before you know it, you're pranked again because they just slow it right back down. Yeah, that was something that bothered me at first, but now I love it. After this, we get another absolutely kick-ass song, being Torn to Pieces. Chuck's flow? Is it still a flow if it's not rap? Anyhow, Chuck's flow on this is absolutely wicked, and this very well could be my favorite song on the album. It's real heavy, it's hardcore, and it's about being eaten alive by another man. And yeah, my heart would probably be sounding something like this song in that scenario. One thing I'll admit about this album is that, honestly, the guitar solos on it don't do a whole lot for me. Not that they're not impressive, because they certainly are, it's just that usually when I'm remembering the songs, the solos themselves don't stick out that much. Fuck. Reflecting back on the songs on here, the guitar solos don't really come to mind too often. Despite that, Chuck's solo on this is probably my favorite one on the album. After this is Evil Dead, and its intro certainly makes it stand out more than the rest of the album. Forget what I said about the solo on Torn to Pieces, because the one on this is better, I would say. Unfortunately, that and the chorus are the highest points on the song. I would consider to be probably the weakest on the album. Another song with some kick-ass drumming, we arrive at the title track and final song on the album, Scream Bloody Gore. It's another intense song, and it's a great way to finish off the album. Chuck's vocals are on point as always, and the ascending guitar riff in the chorus is killer. They're also not afraid to slow down on this one too, and it is so damn heavy. Certainly one of the best tracks on the album. Definitely worthy of being the title track. And maybe they're only starting to grow on me now, but the solo in this is pretty fire as well. Scream Bloody Gore has since gone on to be considered iconic due to its great influence and in being one of the first albums of the death metal genre. While some of the group's later works, where they've evolved more, are considered their best, I always find myself coming back to the one that started it all. Upon its release in 1987, the vinyls and cassettes of this album featured the 10 tracks that we already heard. However, the CDs featured 2 more tracks at the end, being Beyond the Unholy Grave and land of no return. Most CD pressings of this album from 1999 onwards also feature these songs, as well as 2 additional bonus tracks, being live performances of songs from the band's follow-up album Leprosy, which were Open Casket and Choke on It. Many of the following vinyl pressings also feature these tracks, as did the German 2001 pressing on purple vinyl, which was limited to 666 copies. Then most pressings from 2008 onwards dropped the live tracks from the album Leprosy and instead featured a live version of Denial of Life. There was then the 2007 clear with red splatter print, limited to 1,000 copies. There was then a 2010 orange vinyl, limited to 500 copies, as well as a 2011 red vinyl, both of which went back and had the live Leprosy tracks on them. As if these alone weren't enough, in 2016, Relapse Records went to town making more pressings of these, with more than you could even imagine. 2,500 copies on Royal Blue, 2,000 copies on Blood Red, 1,000 copies on Halloween Orange, 500 copies on Bone White and Purple Merge, 100 copies on Swamp Green, a limited edition box set on Bone White and Blood Red Merge that also featured another disc containing some of the band's early recordings and demos, limited to only 500, and then another version of the same box set on a clear vinyl, limited to only 100, that was not sold to the public at all, rather it was gifted to family and friends of the band. For non-vinyl fans, they also released a CD set containing all of the early recordings and more on top of that, limited to only 2,000 copies, as well as a white cassette of the original 12 tracks from the album, limited to only 100 copies. Relapse didn't even stop there either. In 2017, there were 200 copies made on a Bone White and Blood Red merge, as well as another 2 on a red and mustard merge with black and white splatter on it. Furthermore, in 2019, there were 300 copies made on Blood Red and Blue, and then 200 made on a neon violet and bone white. And in 2020, 5,000 copies made on a blood red with pinwheels and splatter, and 250 made on a blood red, aqua, and neon violet merge. Holy hell, this segment's taken longer than it ever has before. I'm almost more exhausted from it than I am to rocking out to the music. All these incredible variants, and your boy seriously got the basic ass regular one. Like much of the world, this album was my introduction to death metal. For me, it just happened by coincidence that this was just the first album I checked out, whereas for much of the world, it's just because back in 1987 when it was released, there wasn't exactly death metal around. If you don't already listen to much metal, I don't know if this would be challenging to get into perhaps. I know back when I was in high school and I was first starting to get into thrash metal, my first couple listens of Slayer, I know even they were too foreignly fast for me compared to the classic rock on the radio I had grown up with. It was like my brain had trouble keeping up with them and even locating melodies in the songs. So I don't know if you might have that same kind of issue with this album if you're not as experienced, but I recommend you give it a spin. See what's up. It's a real shame this is the only Death album with Chris Reifert on drums. His performance throughout consistently is one of my favorite parts of the album. The composition of the songs on this album are great. The immense speed that they can match with the power is incredible. As stated earlier, the solos don't do a lot for me, but it's not as if they hinder the songs at all in any way. One fair criticism this album usually receives is its lyricism, especially when compared to the group's later works. There isn't a whole lot of sustenance to the songs. It's mostly just tales of gore and bloodshed with not a whole lot of meaning to them. Yeah, that's a slight knock on the album, but if a story is entertaining enough on its own, I find it doesn't always need to have meaning, which is somewhat comparable to the way I listen to music. A lot of times it's the instruments and the sounds, which are phenomenal on this album, they generally do more for me than listening to lyrics do, which also in the case of this album, I had to look up a lot of them because it's not always easy to understand to the untrained, growling death metal ear. It's not generally considered the group's greatest work, but it was the first I ever heard, and at the time I certainly had never heard anything close to it. With that being said, I'm going to give Scream Bloody Gore an A grading. It really gets the blood pumping. These songs are so intense and powerful. Putting this on in the car on your drive to work at 6 in the morning really gets you in the mindset that you're going to take care of business and kick ass today. And really, from a hard album like this, there's not much more I could ask. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This has been my review of Death's Scream Bloody Gore. Appreciate your time, and maybe we'll see you again. But, real quick before we go, what were your thoughts on this album? Did I rate Scream Bloody Gore too high or too low? Let me know down below, as well as any other comments, criticisms you might have, or even albums you might want to hear my thoughts on in the future. Take it easy. I appreciate you, and have a blessed day.